Nobody in that stadium, not even the commentators who had been dissecting every shot like surgeons with too much caffeine, could have predicted what was about to happen once the camera stopped rolling and the crowd left the arena. The match itself had been a spectacle, the kind of clash that reminded people why tennis still manages to rival football in pure drama when the right personalities collide. Alcaraz, with his mix of youthful fire and almost reckless aggression, and Raducanu, whose cool exterior hides the kind of steel nerves that could probably defuse a bomb while sipping tea, had just given the audience something unforgettable. But what happened afterwards, in the quiet corridors of the players' area and the supposedly private space of the locker room, was the kind of scene that makes headlines last for weeks. Alcaraz walked in first, drenched in sweat, the kind that sticks like glue after hours of relentless rallies. He tossed his racket bag onto the bench with the casual relief of a gladiator who survived another arena. Raducanu followed a few moments later, less rushed, her stride measured, almost like she had rehearsed it. She wasn't the type to show fatigue openly. Even when her legs were screaming, her expression remained composed, as if to say she'd seen worse, and this was nothing. Their eyes met briefly, the kind of glance players exchange after sharing the weight of a battle that no one else really understands. Then came the twist. Out of her bag, Raducanu pulled a small object wrapped in deep red paper with a golden ribbon tied almost too neatly for someone who spends her life on the road. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of gift you'd expect to see on Instagram stories with heart emojis floating across the screen. It was intimate, deliberate, as though she had planned this for days, maybe weeks. She extended it toward Alcaraz without ceremony, her voice calm, almost casual. For you, don't make a big deal out of it. Now, if you've followed tennis for more than a few months, you know how rare this is. Players are competitive to the point of obsession. Locker rooms are temples of solitude, often heavy with silence or the occasional grunt of someone stretching. Gifts? Those belong to birthdays, sponsor events, maybe retirements. Not after a mixed doubles match in the middle of the season. That's why Alcaraz froze for a second, his usual quick grin nowhere to be found. He took the package, weighing it in his hand like it might explode. Here's where it gets interesting. Because the gift itself wasn't just an object, it was a statement, almost a challenge wrapped in shiny paper. He opened it slowly, peeling back the ribbon with fingers that can unleash 30 mouse-bear serves, but now seemed strangely hesitant. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, the kind you'd find in old European bookstores where the smell of ink lingers for centuries. On the first page, written in Raducanu's unmistakable handwriting, was a single phrase. Every victory is temporary. What matters is what you write in between. That line alone could fuel think pieces for weeks. Was it encouragement? A warning? A personal philosophy she decided to share? Or something more subtle? Perhaps even playful, knowing how the media would salivate if it ever leaked. Because make no mistake, in the modern tennis circuit, symbolism is currency. One thoughtful gift, one phrase loaded with ambiguity, can spark endless theories and fan debate. Alcaraz, to his credit, didn't laugh it off. He didn't toss it aside like a sponsor freebie. He sat there staring at the page, his face caught between genuine surprise and that slight smirk of someone who appreciates a move they didn't see coming. He looked up and said, "You know this is gonna drive people crazy, right?" She shrugged, tying her shoelaces with the kind of detachment that only makes the mystery deeper. It's important to pause here and consider the history of tennis rivalries and partnership. From Navratilova and Evert to Federer and Nadal, what happens off the court often shapes the legends as much as the matches themselves. But rarely do we see such gestures between players so young, so early in their careers. And especially across the gender divide in a sport where mixed doubles is often treated as a sideshow. This was different. It had the weight of intention. Like Raducanu was saying, you're not just another opponent. You're part of a story bigger than today's scoreline. And that's the thing about stories in sport. They sneak up on you. You tune in expecting forehands and breakpoints, and suddenly you're witnessing the birth of a narrative that will be retold in bars, podcasts, and late-night debates for years. This gift, modest as it might seem, planted the kind that could grow into a friendship, a rivalry sharpened with respect, or perhaps something entirely unpredictable. The media, of course, will feast on this. You can already picture the headlines: Raducanu's mysterious gift to Alcaraz, or the notebook that could change tennis. Fans will zoom into blurry screenshots of the notebook cover, speculating on hidden messages. Someone will claim to have decoded her handwriting style. And yes, conspiracy theories will sprout faster than dandelion. Because when two of the most magnetic young stars in the sport share a moment like this, the world refuses to believe it's just innocent. But here's what makes it genuinely fascinating: the context. Both of them carry enormous expectations, the kind that could crush most 20-somethings. Alcaraz is already shouldering comparisons to Nadal, while Raducanu lives under the permanent magnifying glass of being the prodigy who stunned the world at the US Open. They're both chasing not just titles but legacies, and in the middle of that chaos, she chose to hand him a notebook with a cryptic message. That's not random, that's a signal, a deliberate act of shaping narrative, maybe even of control. And if you think this is just overanalysis, remember, athletes are masters of psychology. Matches are not only won with serves and returns, but with subtle gestures, unspoken cues, the art of planting doubt or confidence. A gift like this, given in the raw aftermath of competition, is as much a psychological move as a friendly one. It says, I see you, I know what you're carrying. Here's something that might stay in your mind longer than today's match. Now let's not pretend the romantic angle won't pop up everywhere. It already has. Fans thrive on the idea of chemistry, of sparks flying beyond the baseline. But whether that's true or just a collective projection, what matters is that this gift added layers to their public personas. It blurred the line between rivalry and camaraderie, between professional courtesy and personal connection. That ambiguity is pure gold for narrative-driven sports culture. Imagine being Alcaraz in that moment. You've just fought through exhaustion, adrenaline still buzzing in your veins, and instead of silence or routine, you're handed a symbolic object that could follow you for the rest of your career. Do you see it as a motivator, a reminder, or a challenge? Do you tuck it away in your locker as a keepsake or carry it on tour as a talisman? These are the choices that turn ordinary details into legendary anecdotes. And for Raducanu, the move is just as bold. She risks misinterpretation, endless speculation, even mockery. But that's the price of making statements that endure. By choosing to give something meaningful instead of staying silent, she carved her own role in this shared narrative. It shows a confidence that goes beyond forehands and backhand. It shows someone willing to play the long game, both on the court and in the public imagination. Think about it. How many gifts in sports history have shaped legacies? Ali's words, Jordan's gestures, Federer's tears. These are the moments remembered long after statistics fade. Maybe this notebook will become a footnote, forgotten in the flood of future achievements. Or maybe it will be the first chapter in a saga tennis fans quote for decades. Either way, it has already done its job. It made us stop, question, and wonder. And if you're sitting there thinking, this is wild, I didn't expect tennis to feel like a Netflix drama, well, you're not alone. That's the beauty of these stories. They pull you in even if you couldn't care less about unforced errors or tiebreak percentage. And if you're already hooked by this, do yourself a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because trust me, what's coming next in their journeys is even more unpredictable than this. Here's another layer most people will miss. The phrase she wrote, every victory is temporary. What matters is what you write in between, resonates beyond tennis. It's about life, about the fleeting nature of success, the grind between peaks. For a player like Alcaraz, who's riding a wave of constant pressure to be the next legend, that message could stick like glue. It might remind him to value the quiet moments, the training days, the friendships. For Raducanu, who's faced brutal scrutiny since her breakthrough, it's a mantra, a coded piece of wisdom she's living by and now passing along. That's why it's powerful. It's not just a gift, it's philosophy disguised as stationery. And let's be honest, she could have gone with something ordinary. A signed towel, a lucky charm, a box of chocolates. But no, she chose a notebook, an invitation to write, to reflect, to create. That tells us a lot about how she sees herself and her peers, not just as athletes chasing trophies, but as storytellers of their own journeys. That's a dimension fans rarely get to see, and it's priceless. So picture this. Years from now, when both have collected more titles, faced more defeats, and grown into icons, someone will ask about that notebook. And depending on how they choose to answer, it might become one of those legendary anecdotes that shape how we remember them. Do you still have it? The journalist will ask. And Alcaraz might smile, pull it out of a bag and say, it started here. Until then, the gift lives in that in-between space, between personal gesture and public mystery, between simplicity and symbolism. It's the kind of story that reminds us sports aren't just about scores. They're about human moments that slip past the cameras, about unexpected choices that echo louder than any cheer. And here's the kicker. You don't need to be a hardcore tennis fan to appreciate it, because what Raducanu did was human, universal. It's the kind of act that makes you pause and think about your own victories, your own in-betweens, and maybe, just maybe, that's the point. So if you've followed me this far, you already know what I'm about to say. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now, because these are the stories no highlight reel will ever give you. The ones that make the game feel alive long after the last ball is hit. The locker room itself seemed to amplify the weight of that silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but thick, like it carries 100 invisible conversations. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly. The air smelled of a mix of sweat, fresh towels, and that sharp tang of disinfectant that never quite masks the humanity of the place. On the bench, the notebook didn't just sit there, it demanded attention. Its leather cover caught the light in small gleams. The texture worn enough to feel timeless, yet pristine enough to suggest it hadn't lived a single story yet. That contradiction alone gave it an aura, as though it was less a gift and more a vessel waiting to absorb meaning. Alcaraz's gaze lingered on the object with the same concentration he usually reserved for the seconds before serving on breakpoint. He wasn't just seeing paper and leather, he was seeing intention. The ribbon, now resting beside it, curled slightly at the edges, like a faint echo of the ceremony that had just taken place. Even the way Raducanu had handed it over, without flourish, without waiting for applause, added gravity. She had made it look casual, but casual things don't leave a burn in your memory. Around them, lockers stood in disciplined rows. Metal doors closed, a few hanging open to reveal the mundane reality of athletic life. Shoes, tape, energy gels. Against that backdrop of routine, the notebook stood out like an artifact. Something out of place, too delicate for a world of muscle and sweat. That contrast made it impossible to ignore. Raducanu's body language told its own story. She wasn't watching him with wide-eyed expectation. She wasn't looking for validation. Instead, she tied her hair back, adjusted her shoes, performed those familiar rituals of winding down after a match. But every movement had a calmness that seemed rehearsed, as though she was controlling the stage while pretending there was no stage at all. She knew exactly what she had set in motion. The phrase inside, "Every victory is temporary. What matters is what you write in between," hung in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. Its simplicity was deceptive. For an athlete like Alcaraz, who lives in a world defined by wins and losses, it was almost provocative. Victories to him were the fuel, the validation. Yet here was someone suggesting that the real story lies not in those peaks, but in the valleys that connect them, the unglamorous middle. The atmosphere pressed in. Every sound became sharper. The drip of water from a nearby showerhead, the creak of leather shoes as someone walked down the corridor outside, the faint buzz of an air vent, all of it folded into the moment, layering it with a sense of intimacy that made the gesture feel more profound than it had any right to be. Alcaraz's fingers brushed over the cover again, not quite opening it further, not quite closing it. His thumb pressed lightly on the edge, tracing the stitching. There's something telling about the way athletes interact with objects outside their sport. Their touch, usually so precise and mechanical with rackets or balls, becomes hesitant, exploratory, when faced with something symbolic. The notebook had turned him into a student again, someone reading meaning into every line, even the invisible ones. And in that silence, Raducanu's shrug gained even more weight. A shrug can be nothing, a dismissal, or it can be the most calculated way of saying, "You'll never fully decode this." But that's the point. She didn't explain herself. She didn't need to. The gift wasn't an answer. It was a question disguised as an object. The locker room, usually a place of transition where players shed the match and prepare for the outside world, suddenly became a stage for permanence. Because the truth is, most moments vanish there. Towels get tossed, bottles get drained, players come and go, but some scenes carve themselves into memory. And this was one of them. A notebook on a bench, a phrase on a page, a young man caught between pride and puzzlement, and a young woman who already knew silence would say more than any explanation. The bench itself seemed almost too ordinary to carry the weight of what rested on it. A long strip of wood, polished smooth by years of players throwing themselves down, still damp in spots where sweat had soaked through towels only minutes earlier, and now supporting an object that radiated a kind of quiet defiance against the banality of the room. The notebook's edges caught the light like a subtle halo, its corners sharp, not softened by time, which made it look deliberate, purposeful, as though it had been waiting for this exact setting. Alcaraz's posture betrayed more than words could have. Shoulders still tense, not from the match, but from the tension of deciding how to react. His elbows rested on his thighs, hands loose but hovering, like he wasn't ready to fully let go of the notebook, nor to clutch it too tightly. That half measure said everything. Caught between instinct and reflection, between treating it as just a token or as a message heavy enough to change the air he was breathing. His gaze wasn't fixed in one place. It moved from the cover to the faint golden ribbon lying crumpled beside it, then briefly to Raducanu, whose calm composure only heightened his unsettled focus. The locker room lighting, sterile and flat, did it no favors. No dramatic spotlight, no cinematic warmth. And yet that neutrality made the object even starker. It had no business glowing, but it did, at least in his mind. It was as though the plainness of the environment only magnified its presence, like a painting hung on a blank wall. Every detail, the grain of the leather, the weight of the paper inside, the faint smell of ink that escaped when it first opened, etched itself deeper because the backdrop offered nothing else to distract from it. Raducanu's shoelaces scraped lightly against the floor as she pulled them tight. A small sound, but in that silence it was amplified. She wasn't looking at him now. Her eyes were fixed downward, on the ordinary business of after-match routine. And yet the way she angled her body, not turned away completely, but just enough, created an invisible frame around the scene. It was as though she was saying without words, "This is yours now, what you make of it is beyond me." That half-presence, the balance between proximity and distance, only sharpened the weight of her gesture. The inscription itself, brief as it was, felt longer in his head. He could almost hear it echoing, each word breaking into fragments, rearranging themselves with different emphasis. Every victory is temporary. What matters is what you write in between. Temporary, right between. The phrasing wasn't just advice, it was rhythm, cadence, like something designed to lodge itself into memory. And the ink itself, black but slightly uneven, showed the pressure of her hand, the small human imperfection that made it more personal than anything printed could ever be. Behind them, the metallic clang of a locker door somewhere down the row startled slightly. Not enough to break the moment, but enough to remind him that the world existed beyond this exchange. Yet somehow that reminder faded almost instantly, drowned out by the gravity of what was in front of him. The air seemed heavier around the notebook, as if it had created its own gravitational pull. The ribbon lay on the bench like a discarded clue, curling back toward itself in loose spiral. It was the only thing out of order in the otherwise rigid space, and that touch of softness, of decoration, made the gesture feel even more out of sync with the rawness of athletic life. Rackets leaned in corners, shoes scuffed with clay or hard court dust, bags slumped open revealing protein bars and spare socks. And then this, a gift wrapped as though the chaos of the sport could be paused, even for a moment, to acknowledge something deeper. Alcaraz's breathing slowed, no longer the jagged rhythm of exertion, but something measured, searching, almost cautious. He wasn't just holding a notebook, he was holding a piece of someone else's thought, a private fragment made visible. And he knew, instinctively, that it wasn't meant to be read quickly and set aside. It was meant to linger, to gnaw, to return to him at unexpected moments, like a phrase you can't shake no matter how hard you try. And Raducanu's silence, that was the loudest part of all. Silence can be dismissive, but this wasn't that kind. This was silence that waits, silence that knows it has already said enough. It wasn't defensive or hesitant. It was deliberate, a calculated withdrawal, leaving space for him to wrestle with it alone. She knew explanation would only dilute it. The room, usually a blur of routines and background noise, had turned into a container, trapping this moment like an insect in amber. Nothing moved quickly, not the air, not their gestures, not the passing of time. Everything slowed to the pace of thought, the kind of pace where one object on a bench can feel more monumental than a roaring crowd. Only minutes earlier, the air itself seemed almost layered, as if it carried more than just oxygen and the residue of sweat. There was the faint sting of disinfectant, sharp and medicinal, cutting through everything like a reminder that this was supposed to be a sterile, transitional place. Yet beneath that, subtler notes lingered. The musk of damp towels stacked in a bin nearby, the rubbery undertone from sneakers drying after hours of friction against the court, and somewhere faintly, almost hidden, the clean woody trace of the notebook's leather, releasing itself only when the air shifted around it. Each scent folded over the other, creating an atmosphere that was both ordinary and weighted, grounding the moment but also stretching it. The lights, long fluorescent bars fitted into the ceiling, buzzed with the low monotone hum that becomes part of the silence when no one speaks. Their glow was harsh, clinical, the kind that makes every shadow sharp and every detail unavoidable. The notebook's edges glimmered faintly, catching the flat light and bending it into tiny flickers that made the leather look alive for an instant. Every crease on the bench, every scratch on the locker doors, stood out under that light, as though the room itself wanted to witness and record the scene. On the floor, the tiles were pale gray, scuffed with the black streaks left by countless shoes. Small drops of water glistened here and there, tracing where someone had walked back from the showers. They reflected the light in dull points, almost like stars scattered across a night sky stripped of its brilliance. Against that backdrop, the quiet sound of Alcaraz's breath, now steadier, deeper, created a rhythm that matched the stillness around him. It wasn't just the sound of recovery, it was the sound of thought pushing through the static of the moment. The lockers themselves formed a kind of silent audience. Rows of metallic doors, some dented, some pristine, each one carrying its own history of slams, scratches, careless hands. Their surfaces were matte, cold, and impersonal, yet right now they seemed to lean inward, as though the whole structure of the room had curved itself subtly toward the object on the bench. That small leather rectangle became the gravitational center around which steel, wood, and air all seemed to orbit. The bench creaked faintly when Alcaraz shifted his weight, the sound dry and intimate, like the voice of something old and worn but still resilient. His fingers, still resting on the notebook, traced the stitching again, slower this time, pressing lightly into the grooves where thread met leather. The texture answered back, firm yet slightly yielding, a surface built to last. Even the way the corners felt, sharp but softened with the tiniest rounding, gave away a sense of care in its making. It was not a cheap object. Whoever chose it, chose permanence. Raducanu's shoes, planted on the floor with casual certainty, made no noise now. The laces, taut, cut clean lines across the fabric, and her ankles flexed faintly, the kind of unconscious movement athletes make when their bodies still vibrate with leftover energy. The way her foot tapped once, then stopped, suggested she wasn't restless, just aware. Her presence radiated a calm that was paradoxically louder than any words. She didn't need to break the silence because her silence itself filled the space. Somewhere outside, far down the corridor, a voice echoed briefly, muffled and distant, then faded again into nothing. The world was moving on, but in this closed box of light and steel, time seemed reluctant to follow. Every second felt longer, stretched thin, as though the moment itself refused to dissolve. The ribbon on the bench, loose and curling in its own loops, added softness where everything else was hard edges and clean lines. It was like a trace of ceremony left behind, the proof that this object had once been hidden, deliberately protected before being revealed. Its red and gold looked out of place in the muted tones of gray tiles, white walls, and wooden benches, yet that contrast made it unforgettable. It clung to the bench as though it had no purpose anymore, but its mere presence whispered that purpose had already been fulfilled. The silence pressed closer, not suffocating, but insistent, the kind of silence that demands you notice it. Every detail, the air, the light, the textures, seemed to speak louder than voices could. The room was no longer just a locker room. It had transformed, without warning, into a container for meaning, a capsule of details so exact, it felt etched into memory, even as it was happening. The silence was not an absence, but a presence, dense enough to almost feel on the skin, as though the air itself had thickened. Every breath seemed to carry texture, heavy with humidity, and the faint sting of chlorine drifting from the showers, mixing with the metallic bite of cold steel lockers and the faint sweetness of fresh tape, adhesive still clinging to the edges of a half-unrolled roll, abandoned on a nearby shelf. The layering of these scents made the room feel lived in, yet suspended. A space designed for function but now hijacked by meaning. The walls, tiled in sterile white, reflected the light too sharply, bouncing it in ways that made the edges of shadows look unnatural, almost cut out. Tiny imperfections in the tiles, hairline cracks, smudges of dirt, missed by hurried cleaning, stood out with cruel clarity under the fluorescent glow. On one of them, a faint scuff mark trailed like an accidental stroke of charcoal, evidence of countless feet brushing past. These small, otherwise invisible marks accumulated into a silent testimony of how many had passed through the same space, though none had left behind a moment like this. The bench's surface was smooth but worn, its grain barely visible beneath the varnish rubbed down by years of use. Along its length, shallow scratches caught the light in thin silver streaks, scars from dropped keys, stray zippers, or careless racket frames. Near where the notebook rested, a tiny dent ran across the wood, shallow but noticeable when traced with fingertips. Against this backdrop of wear, the notebook's flawless surface stood out even more unscarred, deliberate, uncorrupted by history. The leather carried its own quiet language. It was dark, almost black, but with undertones that shifted in the light, hints of deep brown rising and receding, as though it absorbed and released the brightness selectively. The stitching was tight, symmetrical, each thread sunk neatly into the edge, the the kind of detail that betrayed both craftsmanship and patience. The faint smell of it lingered, a dry, earthy perfume of tanned hide, evoking bookshops where time itself seems trapped between pages. The ribbon, abandoned now in its lazy curls, had softened at its creases, showing the memory of its earlier knot. Its fibers shimmered faintly with the light, catching in uneven glints of gold where the weave bent. It looked fragile compared to the solidity of the leather, a decorative whisper beside an object built to endure. Yet that fragility amplified the meaning, proof that the object had been wrapped, presented, thought about in advance. Without it, the notebook might have seemed a tool. With it, it became a statement. On the floor, the faint dampness of tracked water spread into thin, irregular patches, some forming imperfect circles where drops had fallen, others streaked into lines where shoes had dragged them. Each patch caught the overhead glow in a dim reflection, transforming the floor into a map of fleeting traces. Near the bench, the pattern stopped, leaving a clear zone of dryness beneath the notebook, as though the object itself had demanded to be untouched by such mark. Even the soundscape of the room played its role. The hum of the lights was steady, unwavering, yet every so often a faint crackle interrupted it, like static threatening to break through. Pipes hidden within the walls ticked faintly, responding to shifts in pressure, each one irregular enough to remind anyone listening that even in silence, nothing is truly still. The faint shuffle of fabric from Raducanu adjusting her sleeves punctuated the stillness, crisp against the backdrop of mechanical noise. It was not a loud sound, but in its sharpness, it rang out more clearly than it should have. The air carried temperature too cool, where the vent exhaled its recycled draft, but layered with warmth clinging to skin, heat radiating off bodies that had only recently stopped moving at full velocity. That balance of cool and warm created a slight haze, not visible but felt, the kind that makes sweat cool slowly, leaving a stickiness that refuses to disappear no matter how often you wipe your arm. In that microclimate, the notebook's dry leather seemed almost alien, untouched by the atmosphere that clung to everything else. The lockers stretched outward in rigid symmetry, each identical yet scarred by individual history. Some bore faint adhesive traces of stickers peeled long ago, others carried scratches that told of hurried hands. Their handles, dull silver, caught only the faintest light, leaving them looking like blunt punctuation marks in the geometry of the room. Together they formed a cold, industrial chorus against the warmth radiating from two living bodies, and the quiet intimacy of the object between them. The notebook sat there unmoving, yet everything around it seemed to lean toward it. The bench, the light, even the silence itself. It was as though the room had reoriented its purpose. No longer a chamber of recovery, it had become a vault. Every sound, every scent, every shadow contributed to sealing this single instant, stretching it so tightly that it felt endless, unbroken, carved into memory before it had even ended. The vault-like quality of the room was reinforced by the way the light seemed to flatten everything, while simultaneously elevating the smallest irregularities into points of focus. On the surface of the notebook's cover, faint natural creases in the leather appeared like fine rivers etched into dark stone, each one visible only when the angle of the fluorescent bars aligned just right. Those ridges gave the sense of movement where none existed, as if the object itself held currents beneath its stillness. The bench beneath it reflected a dull sheen, highlighting a thin border of brightness around the leather, a halo produced not by intent, but by accident, and yet it lent the whole scene the weight of an exhibit placed carefully for scrutiny. The air moved almost imperceptibly, drawn out in gentle currents from vents positioned high near the ceiling. Each exhale of recycled coolness disturbed the silence just enough to ruffle loose strands of Raducanu's tied-back hair, a flicker so small it would be missed by anyone not staring long enough. That same current brushed faintly over the ribbon, coaxing one of its curls into a new angle, its gold threads catching the light differently each time it shifted. The ribbon's movement was the only hint of life in the stillness, a whisper of fragility dancing beside the stoic permanence of the notebook. The metallic lockers amplified the faintest noises. When Alcaraz adjusted his weight, the bench creaked and that vibration passed subtly into the floor, then into the lockers themselves, which returned the sound in a low, almost inaudible hum. It was as though the architecture itself absorbed every gesture and echoed it back in muted acknowledgement. Even the soft press of his thumb over the notebook's stitching seemed to resonate faintly, not audibly, but in the way silence adjusted itself around the gesture. Details sharpened with unnatural clarity. The thin line of moisture trailing from a recently discarded water bottle glistened along the tile, a silver streak ending in a tiny bead that clung stubbornly before surrendering to gravity. The bead stretched and then fell, striking the tile with the lightest click so faint it bordered on imagined, yet enough to become another layer of the soundscape. That solitary drop existed in direct contrast to the permanence of the notebook, fleeting against something designed to endure. The towels piled in the corner carried their own subdued presence, their folds irregular, fabric heavy with absorbed effort. Some edges were crisp white, others stained with faint outlines of clay dust, smudges of color muted by detergent but not erased. Their scent bled faintly into the air, clean but tinged with salt, a reminder of the bodies they had touched. Yet their formlessness made them appear discarded, temporary, while the notebook's compact geometry declared intention. The shadows told their own story. Under the harsh ceiling glow, they weren't soft or diffuse, but hard-edged, sharp lines stretching across the tiles and bending up the benches. The notebook cast a rectangular shadow that merged with the bench's darker grain, its edges trembling faintly each time the ribbon moved. Raducanu's shadow shifted slightly as her foot adjusted, heel grinding against the floor with a quiet rasp. These movements made the stillness even more pronounced, because every tiny shift became monumental when the rest of the room refused to change. The atmosphere wrapped tighter the longer it held. The faint tang of resin from racket grips left open in nearby bags drifted upward, blending with the sterile cool of ventilation. Somewhere, the zipper of a half-closed duffel strained faintly as it settled under its own weight, a muted metallic tension that seemed frozen mid-breath. Even these small traces conspired to frame the notebook as the eye of the storm, the still point around which all incidental chaos arranged itself. The floor's cold gray tiles carried smudges of shoe rubber in arcs and crosshatches, marks of sudden turns, hurried exits, restless pace. Each line hinted at motion now absent, traces of kinetic energy turned fossil. Yet in the square of space beneath the bench, beneath the notebook, no marks intruded. The tiles there remained clear, unbroken, as though untouched by the same forces. That untouched space created the impression of a boundary, an invisible circle around the object, a territory claimed by its presence. Every texture, every scent, every sound folded back toward that center. The notebook wasn't large, it wasn't flamboyant, but its quiet density commanded more than the space of its edges. It altered the room's balance. Everything else, the creak of wood, the hum of fluorescent light, the faint shuffle of fabric seemed to orbit it, obeying a rhythm it imposed without effort. The vault was not created by walls or locks, but by the sheer gravity of an object that refused to be ordinary. The gravity of the notebook thickened the very air around it, a quiet dominance that felt almost unnatural in a room designed for nothing more than recovery and routine. The leather didn't gleam so much as absorb light, drinking it into its surface, giving back only faint, muted reflections that looked more like memories than brightness. Along its spine, the stitching formed a perfect seam, each knot identical, each gap measured with precision, as if whoever had crafted it had believed the smallest imperfection would shatter the object's integrity. That seam drew the eye down its length, a straight line cutting across the randomness of scuffs and scratches that marked the bench beneath it. The bench itself had aged into a palette of contradictions. Its varnish was thin in some places, glossy in others, as though it had been rubbed down unevenly by years of restless bodies. Near the notebook, the surface seemed darker, a patch of polished wood worn smoother by countless hands pressing against it, creating an accidental frame around the object. The contrast was stark. Wood that bore the weight of time, leather that looked like it had just been born into the world. Together they created a tension history pressed against possibility. The ribbon continued its soft rebellion against stillness. Its fibers shimmered unevenly, gold threads catching bursts of fluorescence, red threads swallowing it back. One curl had twisted tighter than the others, its loop rising slightly above the bench, a small arc that cast a faint, trembling shadow onto the wood. That shadow wavered with the subtlest air currents, so delicate it seemed alive, like the heartbeat of something too fragile to be touched. Every surrounding object seemed forced into a supporting role. The lockers, lined in rigid symmetry, wore their dents like scars, but none of those marks carried weight in this moment. Their dull metallic faces reflected vague smears of light, flat and cold, while the notebook radiated warmth without trying. A half-zipped duffel bag slumped against one of the lockers, fabric creased into deep folds, its zipper teeth glinting faintly, but even that faint metallic glimmer seemed staged only to contrast the quiet richness of leather. On the tile, moisture patches lingered like ghosts of movement. Some were near invisible smudges, others clear puddles shaped like fractured circles. A thin streak stretched diagonally, drying slowly at the edges, its uneven outline resembling the dragging motion of a shoe. Every mark was temporary, fading even as it existed, while the notebook remained unyielding, its permanence magnified by the fleeting nature of everything around it. The air hummed with layers of faint, overlapping sounds that blended into a tapestry of near silence. The fluorescent bars exhaled their constant drone, a sound neither loud nor ignorable, a reminder of electricity coursing endlessly above. In the walls, the pipes clicked at irregular intervals, as though the room itself had a pulse. From the far corridor, an echo reached in, a muffled thud of something dropped, followed by nothing. These fragments slipped through the space, each one instantly swallowed, leaving the center untouched. Even the towels stacked haphazardly in the corner took on a strange gravity. Their folds drooped, heavy with absorbed salt and water, edges fraying slightly where fabric had worn thin. The pile exuded a damp weight, a soft mound collapsing inward, yet even in its disorder it seemed to arrange itself around the central moment. Its muted whites and grays dulled into the background, making the notebook's dark richness more pronounced by contrast. The shadows lengthened in their rigidity. Hard lines cut beneath the bench, crisp and unyielding, colliding with the tile's neat grid to form intersecting angles. The notebook's shadow sat square, stubborn, its edges trembling only when the ribbon stirred. Raducanu's shadow leaned beside it, the outline of her arm curved downward where she adjusted her sleeve, a faint blur of movement that vanished the moment she stilled again. Every shift of shadow became an event, magnified by the stillness of the rest. The atmosphere pressed inward with quiet insistence, as though the room had tightened its borders. The faint chill from the vent brushed over skin with a sterile crispness, but it met the lingering warmth radiating from bodies that had only recently burned through hours of exertion. That balance of temperatures created an invisible haze. Not seen but felt, a layering of contrasts, hot and cold, fleeting and lasting, chaos and control. At the center of it, untouched, unbent, the notebook seemed to defy all of it, holding a gravity that nothing else in the room could break. The air's weight seemed almost tangible now, layered in invisible textures that clung to skin, fabric, and even thought. Each breath carried subtle traces of everything absorbed into the room. The sharp sterility of bleach baked into the tiles, the faint metallic tang of steel and sweat colliding, the earthy persistence of leather releasing itself in whispers, and beneath it all the salt-sweet residue of effort, lingering on the skin. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was inescapable, an atmosphere thick enough to etch itself into memory. The light above didn't simply illuminate, it dissected. Every surface, no matter how mundane, surrendered its secrets. The bench's varnish revealed hairline fractures, running like miniature veins across the wood, darkened where years of sweat had seeped in. The tiles gleamed at odd angles, uneven, some dulled by wear, others polished smooth from countless shoes dragging the same path. The stitching on the notebook, under that pitiless glow, looked impossibly precise. Each thread pulled taut without deviation, a geometry that demanded attention even in silence. Sound, too, had become exaggerated. The hum of the fluorescent tubes was no longer background. It was a steady drone that seemed to anchor the entire room. Tiny clicks from the pipes punctuated it irregularly, like a code no one could decipher. The faint scrape of Raducanu's sleeve adjusting against her skin cut through with startling clarity, fabric on skin magnified into a whisper that echoed longer than it should have. Even the silence had texture. It pressed in, heavy and deliberate, turning the smallest movements into seismic events. The ribbon's curl had loosened slightly, shifting position with each subtle draft of air from the vent. Its gold threads sparked in fragmented flashes, then dulled again as the angle shifted. That small shimmer became a pulse of its own, a rhythm of brightness that marked the passing of seconds without clocks. The ribbon's softness contrasted violently with the hardness of everything else. The steel lockers, the rigid tiles, the bench's unforgiving wood. Its fragility, lying discarded beside the notebook, seemed like proof that something delicate had already been sacrificed to expose what remained. Shadows layered themselves like brushstrokes. The notebook's dark rectangle stretched beneath it, its edges so clean they might have been drawn with a ruler, trembling only when the ribbon moved. The bench's legs cast longer, sharper lines that crossed with the grid of the tiles, creating intersections that fractured the floor into shapes. Raducanu's shadow leaned close, her outline bending across the bench and bleeding into Alcaraz's, two silhouettes overlapping faintly without fully merging. Those overlaps told their own story, silent and fleeting but undeniable. Even the objects that didn't matter seemed drawn into the moment. The duffel bag against the locker slouched deeper, its zipper teeth glinting as though reflecting something not present in the room. The towels in the corner sagged into themselves, their folds forming valleys of shadow, the dampness darkening fabric into gradients of gray. A single water bottle rolled a fraction of an inch on its side, producing the faintest clink against the tile before settling again. Each of these details, mundane, disposable, seemed to bend toward the same gravitational center, as though the notebook itself had forced them into alignment. Temperature played tricks on perception. The vent's cool current stroked skin in thin drafts, sharp and almost surgical, but it clashed with the warmth still radiating from muscles recently spent. That collision created a sensation of layers, as if one stood both in chill and heat at once. The notebook's leather resisted both, retaining its own neutral presence, untouched by the fluctuations that weighed on everything else. It was immune, self-contained, an island of stillness in an atmosphere of contradiction. Nothing in the room moved quickly, yet every detail vibrated with intensity. The floor's scuff marks, the dent in the bench, the faint unevenness of tile grout, all appeared sharper, as though sharpened not by vision but by awareness. Every imperfection screamed of impermanence, while the notebook radiated permanence. That contrast wrapped around the moment like invisible walls, sealing it in, trapping it so tightly that even time seemed reluctant to flow. The room itself seemed to breathe in a rhythm, not its own, a rhythm dictated by the weight of stillness, pressing against every surface. The air carried an almost granular density, like fine dust invisible to the eye, yet settling across skin, across fabric, across thought. The smell of disinfectant had sunk so deep into the grout of the tiles that it felt permanent, layered over years of the same chemical being poured, scrubbed, rinsed, and yet never truly gone. Beneath it clung subtler scents, the faint sourness of rubber soles worn down by sudden stops, the mineral tang of evaporated sweat, and the faintly metallic undertone of steel lockers, cooling after hours of fluorescent heat. Each note in the air remained suspended, refusing to dissipate, forming an aroma that was less smell and more atmosphere. The fluorescent lights overhead, unwavering in their sterile brightness, cut into every edge without mercy. Their harsh whiteness did not soften but sharpened, carving the notebook's outline into clarity so pure it looked staged. The leather cover absorbed most of it, pulling the glow into its dark grain, but the edges responded differently, reflecting tiny, narrow bands of brightness that traced its perimeter like a frame. The stitching caught light unevenly, one thread glimmering brighter than the next, so that the seam itself seemed alive with motion when stared at long enough. The ribbon, by contrast, did not absorb, it shimmered, catching fragments of illumination and breaking them apart into flecks of gold and red. Every time the vent's draft disturbed it, the shimmer shifted, a living spark within a still tableau. Sound was minimal, but what existed filled the room with disproportionate weight. The buzz of the lights remained steady, its frequency just high enough to drill faintly into awareness, impossible to tune out. From the walls came occasional ticks, tiny snaps of expanding metal hidden behind tiles, irregular and unpredictable, but always sharp enough to remind the listener of machinery at work. A drip echoed faintly from the showers beyond the corridor, the delay between each drop stretching longer than seemed natural, as though time itself hesitated before releasing the next. Fabric whispered against skin, in brief bursts, the adjustment of a sleeve, the shift of posture, and each sound carried clarity amplified by the absence of anything else. The bench had its own language. Its wood varnish, worn down by repetition, released faint notes of age, resin dulled but still faintly aromatic when warmed under the bodies that had used it. Its surface bore shallow grooves, invisible at first glance, but tangible under fingers, scars of past collisions, of rackets dropped carelessly, or bags dragged across it. These imperfections caught shadows that ran in tiny lines across the grain. Shadow within shadow, details stacked upon details. Near the notebook, the wood appeared darker, smoother, its surface polished by constant contact until it reflected light in a thin, glassy sheen. That sheen amplified the halo around the notebook, as though even the bench had reshaped itself to serve its presence. The lockers, rigid and metallic, formed the geometry of the room. Their vertical lines rose in precise order, gray paint dulled into matte by countless touches. Some carried dents near their bases, shallow inward curves that spoke of careless kicks or collision. Others bore faint outlines of adhesive, long since peeled away, ghost marks where stickers or labels had once clung. Their handles, small and rectangular, glinted only faintly, reflecting not full light but fragments, small squares of brightness scattered across steel. Together they gave the impression of a silent chorus, uniform in shape, yet each carrying scars of different histories. The floor tiles, pale gray with darker veins running through them, mapped the history of movement. Scuff marks crisscrossed in arcs and zigzags, each one a fossil of a sprint stopped too quickly or a restless shuffle in place. Water stains spread irregularly, forming outlines like continents on a map, edges feathering as they dry. One droplet, perfectly spherical, clung stubbornly to a groove in the tile, capturing the ceiling's light within its curved surface, glowing like a bead of glass. Around the bench's base, however, the floor was clearer, a zone of relative emptiness, as though invisible boundaries prevented chaos from intruding on this space. The towels in the corners sagged deeper into themselves, their folds collapsing into soft valleys and ridges. Dampness had darkened the fabric unevenly, patches of shadow spreading like ink stains across their surface. The pile, though shapeless, seemed heavy, pressed down by gravity and use, yet somehow submissive, background to the scene unfolding around the bench. Their muted whiteness made the notebook's dark richness stand out sharper, pulling attention back again and again to the object that refused to blend in. Temperature layered itself into perception. The vent's current delivered clean coolness in ribbons of air, brushing the skin with sterile precision. But each contact collided with the warmth radiating off skin and fabric. That clash created subtle drafts, invisible eddies swirling at ankle height, moving across the bench, slipping beneath the ribbon, stirring it just enough to prove the air was alive. Heat clung to the wood longer than to the tiles, leaving a faint gradient where the bench's edge met the colder floor. The notebook, untouched by either extreme, seemed neutral, holding its own internal climate. Everything, every fragment of sound, scent, texture, and temperature, drew itself toward that center. The notebook did not move, yet it commanded. Around it, the ordinary became extraordinary. The disposable became permanent. The fleeting became fossilized. The room's geometry, its noises, even its silence bent inward, as though conceding that this single object, resting quietly on the bench, had rewritten the very rules of presence.